Okay, great. So welcome everyone. I'm pleased to introduce Jean Boulton. Jean studied physics at Oxford and completed her PhD in quantum mechanics at Cambridge before turning to management in the social sciences. She has held executive management positions in large corporations, and the combination of theoretical physics and hands-on leadership led her to complexity science, which she's been immersed in for nearly 3 decades. She's a fellow of the Institute of Physics and a visiting academic at Bath and Cranfield. Her 2015 book, Embracing Complexity, became a standard reference in the field, and her recent The Tao of Complexity explores the resonances between complexity science and Taoist philosophy. Today, she'll bring these perspectives to questions about altruism, whether it's an orientation, an intention, or an inquiry, and what imagination and intuition have to do with engaging with an emerging future. So with that, I will turn it over to Jean. Welcome, Jean.
Thanks very much, and it's lovely to be here. It's really great for me to engage with different groups of people and talk about the complexity and Taoist view, but applied in different perspectives. So what I wanted to do though was just before I launch in to a talk is I wondered what kind of things you might like me to talk about. This is the book, just so that you've seen it, The Tao of Complexity. And the book kind of gives it starts, as I'll explain, with a very worldview ontological frame, a kind of understanding of what complexity has to say about the way the world is and the way it changes, those kind of questions. I relate it to a Taoist ontology and make the remark that they're very similar indeed. And the second half of the book is then looks at, well, what does that mean for practice at the level of the global, the organizational and the individual and all things in between. But are there particular things that interest you guys here that you particularly think would be interesting for me to explore? So I don't know, Jack and Finn, should we do that in chat, or what's the best way to do that?
I think whatever people are comfortable with. If you prefer to just leave it in chat, that's fine. If you want to quickly unmute yourself and just say out loud, that's also fine. Whatever people like to do.
So any thoughts? You may have no thoughts, but it's just nice to hear from you. And if you don't like that question, the other question I would be interested in is, what does altruism mean to you? What is altruism? How would you define it? So either of those questions, but just a few notes in chat would be lovely. Otherwise, Jack and Finn, you're going to have to write something.
So we got Jamie here saying, I suppose I'd be interested in looking at effortless action and how it works with ITN framework.
ITN's the neglected tractable I'm missing the EA thing, right? Importance, neglectedness, tractability, in terms of assessing potential cause areas.
Right. And Wu Wei, and from Matilda, altruism to me equals supporting the flourishing of sentient beings. We have, I'm going to say this name correctly, Megan Lata. Still very new to this area, so generally excited to learn. My Spy says importance. Lorelei says interested in practical applications of Taoism as well. Have only engaged with Taoism theoretically. And again from My Spy, altruism for me is aligning of my humane qualities to be empathetic enough to help out.
Great.
Oh, excuse me. I'll speak my thoughts. That's okay. So actually, I agree with what Lorelei said. I'd be really interested to hear anything that you think would be particularly actionable, whether it's within personal relationships or within like some sort of office or work context.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's really useful, and I'm interested that the way that you're talking about altruism is very much the way I feel into it, which is it's more like, you know, how do we act with with others, and indeed the planet and the future in mind. You know, it is a kind of, you know, what to be altruistic is not just to think about me. And in fact, interestingly, the definition in the dictionary, which I looked up earlier today, is actually about being not self-interested, which I'm not quite sure I'm altruistic in that sense. You know, I think I matter too. I'm part of the system. And it, as Zoya says, it's putting others' needs before my own. I'm not sure about that. I think it's seeing us all as co-creating the future, and I have to think about everyone, including myself, in moving forward. So that's how I probably see it in a systemic. I like the way you've used the word integrative altruism, because I think it's both. It's like the phrase, no one's safe until we're all safe, or I can't just think about myself because the future's co-created and for us all. So I'll come back to that phrase, but I like that idea of integrative altruism. Okay, well, let me start. I'm going to start, I think, with this this idea of ontology. So the three things I'm going to really talk about, and I will include this this Taoist view, is what I'm going to describe this ontological stance. And it took me years to understand. It's as people who know me will know, it's one of my favorite words. But what I'm talking about is it's really important that we understand for ourselves how we think the world works, what we think is change. Do we think there's a real world out there? Do we think it's largely static and occasionally change, or it's always in process? And some of that processual change is what creates stability. You know, what do you implicitly understand by the nature of reality, the nature of change, that has a sort of overarching view? And a bit like Einstein said, you can't solve a problem by using the same thinking that got you into it. It is important, I think, and a practical thing to do, to actually explore this idea of how what am I assuming about the way the world changes. So the punchline is that the complexity worldview in the way that I have explored it is almost identical to the kind of ontological frame, the cosmology of Taoism, the philosophy of Taoism, that they understand the world in very similar ways. And for me, that's incredibly exciting, because how did people, you know, in 500 BC, the Chinese Taoists, come upon a way of understanding the world that is so similar to this modern science of complexity? So that's my first point I'm going to talk about. The second point I want to talk about is what does that mean for knowing about the world? And I'm going to talk about the role of the imagination and intuition and subjectivity that kind of follow from this ontological frame, and explore this thought about, you know, is the world a kind of material thing, or is it more complex than that? And then the third thing I'm going to talk about is in a sense, what does that mean for altruism, which includes, in a practical sense, I think, what do these ideas mean for what you do, both at the global level, organizational and the interpersonal. So I will look at this, you know, what do you take from Taoism and indeed from the science of complexity. So that's now my spy has raised a hand. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, in all of the table of contents, I just have, I think that this is missing, that is, I think, also pointed in the chat, that we generally talk about all of these philosophies, most of these philosophies, well discussion, but when it comes to practical implementations of these things, then we fail drastically, because to fit these things in any reasonable framework, like ITN framework, importance, tractability, negative, it becomes very problematic. So it would be nice to include a segment for practicality kind of thing.
Yes, I think I just said that, my spy. That was my third bit. I'm going to do that. I'm not going to talk about the ITN framework, but yeah, that's great. Okay, right. So what am I? Let me find my notes. So the science of complexity, the ontology, the worldview that comes from complexity, the field of complexity was developed by physicists and biologists in the last century. Prigogine, Ilya Prigogine in particular, was a founding thinker for me. And these thinkers were really interested in, so the biologists were thinking about why is it that biological organisms sustain themselves? How does that happen? How do we get a sort of relative stability and a form that emerges and sustains itself? What is it that happens there? And Prigogine's work, which was triggered by thinking about the evolutionary process, came from the work of Belazov and Zhabotinsky, who were Russian scientists, and they had discovered in some experiments that they were doing with physical chemistry with liquids in a particular situation, that swirls and patterns formed on the surfaces of these liquids. And the view at the time was that there was something that had gone wrong with the experimentation. There was no understanding, there was no explanation for how form emerged in these liquids. And what Ilya Prigogine got the Nobel Prize for in 1977 was to realize that the situation that we were looking at was what's called an open system. So in other words, that the chemistry in that situation was open to exchange of energy in that case with the world outside it. So this idea of open systems allows you to understand, and it's the same with how does a cell self-organize and sustain itself? How indeed does an ecology organize and sustain itself? It has to have some engagement with its wider context in order to energize itself and have the opportunity to exchange information, matter or energy. So this idea of open systems is really where the science of complexity started, both in physics and biology. And it led to a kind of ontological understanding, an understanding of change that has a number of words and ideas that are embedded in it. So the world shows up in terms of patterns of relationships. So what do I mean by that? So if I look at the wood that's over there, I live close to a wood, and the pattern of relationships there are yew trees that were very well established, a certain sort of non-deciduous tree, and it supports the kind of soil that wild garlic likes. So here we have an ecology where there's a kind of co-evolutionary, there's a so not a co-evolutionary, a self-balancing process where you tend to get garlic and yew trees, the soil supports that, and it kind of locks out other things. So it's quite difficult for other kinds of plants to come into that situation. Down the road, there's a different sort of soil and tree and orientation, and that has completely different flora and fauna, which is also sustained. So that's an example of a self-organizing, self-sustaining system that requires this kind of openness to the wider world in order to make that work. If you look at an organization in similar ways, or a community in similar ways, it will have a particular way of working, a particular pattern of relationships that isn't identically replicated, but often is self-regulating, self-organizing, is sustaining, and that idea of patterning is a very important idea in the science of complexity. And so if you, for example, take a family, a family does not work in any kind of mechanical predictive way. If I said to you, what's made your family the way it is? what's the patterns and the norms of behavior that you would get in from your family, then you would be able to tell me about certain patterns of relationships and certain ways of doing things that sustain. But it wouldn't be identical. And for example, if dad can't cook the tea, then maybe mum cooks the tea. But in some families, there's a kind of replicability of behaviours, and maybe there's a norm that people eat tea at the same sort of time and around the table. So there's something about patterning that you get out of understanding a complex world. The other part of this patterning, and this is I'll bring it back to Taoism as well, is that it's a processual view. It's a processual philosophy. So in other words, it's the very movement in an organization or a family, the very freedom to move that allows these patterns to replicate and be repeated. It's a reciprocal relationships that are not identical, but allow patterns to sustain. So it's the very movement that creates stability, and equally sometimes can lead to a shift in patterns or a collapse or a movement sometimes into chaos. So it's a processual worldview. And it has a real emphasis on things being contextual and shaped by history. So why does all this matter then? Before I answer that question, just to make the point, when you read the Tao Te Ching, when you look at Taoism, it has a very similar kind of view. So, for example, the Taoists talk about the fact that the end is in the beginning. There's a sense in which the things stabilize, but that they're going to move into something else. So it has the same flow philosophy, the same processual worldview. It emphasizes context and history more than the idea of things are universally true or totally, always applicable. So that the Tao ontology has these same elements of shaped by history, endless novelty, always becoming. Prigogine, in his writing about complexity, one of his early books was called From Being to Becoming, meaning we should look at the world less as a set of things interconnected, but as a set of processes always becoming, a set of patterns always moving, always becoming. And that the very thing that creates change is also the thing that allows things to stabilize. And the other thing to add in that, and it's something that's very inherent in Taoism, is the idea of things always emerging, or there is an emerging possibility, not necessarily the potential for emergence is there. And emergence, complexity will tell you, is about the essential not being able to know what the future holds. That's not to say the future is random. The future is shaped by the past and the present. But we can't know exactly what it will look like, and there'll be many aspects to it that are things that we've perhaps never seen before. So that's a kind of understanding of the ontology of complexity and Taoism. And let me just pause there and maybe put some things in the chat. Any thoughts on that before I then move on to the sort of, so what does it mean? Any thoughts, any reflections on that? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Is it okay to flag something by audio? Because I have a cat sitting on my lap. It's hard to type just quickly.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I'd be really interested if there's space for you to say a little bit more about how you conceptualize emergence. Because my sense is that it's kind of a placeholder we have for like a really kind of hard set of dynamics to understand that are like extremely sensitive to the different objects that we're looking at and how they interact with each other. But it feels to me like a somewhat unsatisfying placeholder for something that, as you said, is not random. There are mathematical rules that underpin what happens, I think. And it seems like we're kind of at a pre-paradigmatic stage with what emergence means. But I'd love to hear a bit more from you about that if there's space at any point. Thanks.
Well, let me answer that now. So my there are two traditions in complexity. There's what Edgar Morin, a French philosopher, has called general complexity, And then there's something that is he calls restricted complexity. So what I'm talking about is before or beyond mathematics. It cannot be captured mathematically. And although there's certain that it's very difficult to capture emergence mathematically, because there's often something in an open system. There's always new things coming in. So you can't capture a closed system can, to at least a first order degree, be defined mathematically. But an open system, it's often the detail, it's the variation and the detail that creates the very change. It adds to something. So I'm not in any sense whatsoever defining emergence in a mathematical sense. It doesn't have a precise definition. One of the best writers about emergence, in my view, is Stuart Kaufman, who's a complexity biologist. You can find bits of YouTube stuff. If you Google him and emergence, you can find some very interesting stuff. But emergence is really talking about there's a new dimension, there are new aspects to the whole system that change the frame. It's almost like they change the landscape. It isn't just that there's a reorganization of the deck chairs in some sense. There's something completely new. Now, because it emerges from what was there, what you're doing, and this is very Taoist, it's a bit like something novel comes in and it's interacting with what's already there. And then it may be that the whole system changes, you know, so to give you a kind of example, back from the 1990s, when text messaging was invented, I was there, I remember it. It was not regarded as very important. The providers didn't charge for it in any sense. You know, it was just like a thing. But there was a real pull factor from their customers who loved it and wanted more of it. And initially, you couldn't send text messages between different providers. You know, there was no way of doing that. So along comes text messaging. It's not a strategy. It was invented to remotely test mobile phones. It's not regarded as part of a marketing campaign. It wasn't intended. It came along and it changed everything. It changed the way people use mobile phones. It went on to change parenting. It changed language. It changed the way we communicate with friends and with children. It had a radical impact on social life and business life in a way that you couldn't possibly have imagined, that was not even intended. So that's what I mean by emergence. It kind of, something triggers a radical reorientation and some new factors that come in. Sometimes it's triggered by a new invention, a new technology. Kaufman uses it in terms of biological systems. Sometimes one animal changes. He gives an example of a swim bladder, which was, allowed a particular fish to change its position in the water through filling this swim bladder with air. But it was then colonized by a certain sort of bacteria who found this was a new place to live, and you suddenly found that this new dimension of the swim bladder allows for an evolution in a whole variety of ways you couldn't possibly imagine or was intended, which then changes the future. So that's what I'm talking about with emergence. And it's about the whole focus on Taoism and in the whole ontology of complexity, the whole way it understands the way the world is. You've constantly got this kind of interplay between newness and variety and what's relatively stable, and how these new things invade and change what's existing. So that was a great question. Thank you, Matilda.
Thank you so much, Jean. That was fascinating. Thanks.
Yeah. Anybody else?
So I actually have a question that was coming up for me when I was going over sort of the first part of your book, like along these lines. So the question is, like, to what extent do your practical conclusions, like giving up the predict and control management stance, depend on the metaphysical claims like ontological indeterminism and process ontology, or could they stand on epistemological grounds alone, like chaotic open systems make prediction impossible in practice. Sort of like, what's the minimal metaphysical commitment needed? And can somebody accept the practical advice while remaining agnostic on the deeper ontology?
Yes, yes. So I think some of what I talk about, quantum physics, for example, you don't need to go there. I think it would be hard to, well, I think the process perspective, the processual ontology, the always becoming, is quite key. But the way I get to it practically, with managers, I don't talk about ontology to managers, but I would say things like, have you been involved in a business strategy? Yes. Has your strategy gone to plan? How many times does it go to plan? Well, quite often it doesn't go to plan. So I might have a room of people, and then I say, well, why doesn't it go to plan? What goes wrong? So they then explore with me, or with each other. The world changed in ways we didn't expect. There was new competition. Somebody had a new invention. We didn't have the resources to do what we were doing. We'd misunderstood the message. All those kind of things actually change the frame of the world. So then I say, okay, so they kind of define the complex world for me in very ordinary terms. They tell me about uncertainty and what causes it, and they tell me about change in the wider world. And then I say to them, so you're still going to plan and have a strategy. I'm not suggesting that we just give that up. How would you do it differently with those uncertainties in mind? And they say things like, well, we might experiment a bit more first, or we might have a portfolio of approaches, and the actual strategy itself will kind of uncover the nature of the environment in which we're trying to set our strategy. We'd review it more often. We'd hold some contingency back so we could adapt. We'd see adaptation as normal rather than an error. So do you see what I mean? So I'm moving into this middle ground where I don't have to use any long words at all, and I'm just saying to people, tell me about your world. Another example that I might use is I'm a social worker, and I'm coming along to your family, and I'm going to classify your family as one of 4 types, and then I'm going to tell you how to improve your family. What would you say? And you will say, well, my family's not like that. You don't understand. It's a complex. It's caused by granny and what happened in the past, and you don't know this, and it's where we live, and somebody was very ill. So they will tell me about the complexity of their family, and then I'll say, well, so if I'm a good social worker, how can I help you then? And the answer is, I need to attune to the vibes and the patterns of relationships and the way you do things. I need to get to know you and attune to that. And then I might, either through questions or through suggestions, nudge and make, find ways of maybe moving you on, or unpicking some of the difficulties in those patterns. So that's the kind of way that I talk about it, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yes, I'm glad you like that, My Spy. I don't talk about ontology to managers, so. Okay, shall I move on a little bit then? Any other comments or questions at this stage?
Okay. I had one question about process ontology, but I'm happy to save that for later if you like to move on up first.
No, go for it, Jack. No, I'm happy to.
So like in art, so I'm totally with you when you're like, let's understand the universe instead of being made up as things, like it's made up of patterns and processes, right? But then the question that comes up for me is like, okay, okay, processes of what, or patterns in what, right? And so I guess I'm sort of like, what does it mean for you to say when you say, it's processes all the way down or something? Because if I think about, for example, like a glider in a cellular automata, like in Conway's Game of Life, right? Like It's not a thing. It's really just like a pattern propagating, like as the state of the cellular automaton changes, but there's still like the cells and the values and the rule
Yeah.
change, right? Or if there are no particles per se as things in themselves, but they're just excitations of the quantum fields, there's still like excitations of the quantum fields, like there's still a substrate there. So I'm just sort of wondering how that cashes out in terms of when you're talking about process ontology, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, good question. So there's a deeper answer to that and a less deep answer. So I'm going to, if this is okay with everybody else, that's a good question. So if you take a mathematical model, it's a thing interacting with rules, you know, by and large. So cellular automata, which is a very, very, very simple model of something that displays an edge of chaos that went down in the annals of history as a thing, came out of, you know, a 1984 model of cellular automata, and they do define things as things. You know, you can look at voids in mathematical, you know, in mathematical models of murmurations of starlings in a similar way. But if you look at the real world in terms of a galaxy, for example, or a human system or an ecology, then you know, what's going on in a galaxy is so I'll come back to your deeper question about quantum physics, but it is you know, what makes this galaxy this depends on the kind of, you know, the amount of energy that was in the initial swirling, the amount of energy and matter that was there, and how there's a complex interplay between different physical forces, you know, and they depend on the energy that was there and on the particularity of the form of it. And it will kind of weave into being this particular planet or this particular galaxy in a way that is processual, and is indeterminate, and certainly, you know, from the purposes of you know, we can understand some of the mechanisms, and we can say on, you know, largely if you've got this much stuff in this swirl, you know, you might end up with these kind of stars or not. But it's emphasizing this kind of, and this galaxy is in a sense always becoming. So in the sky, you know, there's no two galaxies alike, there's no two planets alike, but they're always, and they're always moving. There's something about there's a shifting, moving, interacting. You know, even our solar system isn't as stable as we think it is. You know, that it at some point it'll be less stable. You know, there's all sorts of things going on. So in that sense, whether you're talking about an ecology or a family or a galaxy, there's something about emphasizing that things are always changing, but often that change creates stability. So that's my kind of level one answer to your question. The level two answer, and this, you know, some people are going to switch off and not be interested in this, is when you get to this idea of quantum physics, some of the really interesting work on quantum physics, and you can look at Carlo Rovelli's work, for example. He talks about relational quantum physics, and other people have written about this. So that when you get down to the bottom of it, it isn't like, they're not like things. They're not even like, you know, there's two aspects to it. This is going to get very technical for some people, but what it's really saying is that what shows up in the quantum world is it can have two impossible things can happen at the same time within different relationships. So it's a kind of relational view, that the only thing that kind of seems to end up being like things in our world is a relational thing between these kind of quantum fields. So if you want to go in that direction, there's something that takes you into something that's really ontologically indeterminate, as opposed to, it's not just hard to know, it's not knowable because it's not there. And that's a very exciting kind of underpinning of a kind of beyond materialism view. It's where people say, you know, the mystical, the ephemeral kind of goes back into the the body of the nature of things. It's not like there's a kind of material thing, albeit a kind of fuzzy field. There's something beyond that. Now, that's very difficult to unpick in 5 minutes, and difficult anyway, but it's interesting to me, and it leads me on. I'm going to go on to my second bit. Is it leads me on then to how do we know about this complex world? And so the first thing, which is what you would do as a manager or as a consultant as well, is it's a subjective view often. So I'm saying to you, go into this board meeting and work out how to intervene. You know, I want you to help this board meeting go well, or, you know, I want you to join. So I'm going to, if I'm good at this, I'm going to try and attune to what's going on in that meeting. You know, ideally, I might have met some of the people before. I've got some of the history of the organisation, but there's a subjectivity about my attunement to that. You know, what are the patterns of relationships? What's normal here? You know, what's going on? You know, what's hidden here? You know, I'm trying to attune to all those things. And how am I attuning to something that's subjective? There's no right answer to it. There are wrong answers. It's not a relative view, if you see what I mean. But I can't be precise about it. If there was many of us there, there's something called critical subjectivity, which is saying, you know, let's take a range of views and start to hone in on some kind of sense of what's going on in the room. But my way of knowing is going to have to be, you know, partly through my intuition, through my body, through my imagination. You know, there's something that beyond reason. I can't appropriate the complex world just with my rational left brain thinking. There's something beyond that I'm trying to attune to in working in that relational way. So what I'm doing in working with these ideas, and also from Taoism, this is emphasized. So The Art of War, which is a Taoist book in particular, says a lot. Well, also the Tao Te Ching, it says a lot about, you know, we need to be still and attune to the patterning there. We need to apprehend the wider context. And in really kind of saying what is there, what is happening, you know, I'm then able to spot opportunities or notice tiny shifts and unravelings and new shoots. So there's a kind of sense in which I'm both trying to see what is there, and I'm also trying to attune to what is new, and at the same time. They're both going on at the same time, and that part of my process. And it's not to say that you're not using reason and analysis and facts. You know, as a physicist, I'm used to working with business strategy. I'd want to know what was going on. So I think that you know, there's something that you add to that in order to apprehend the complex world. So let me just stop there again. Any thoughts on that? So Jamie, you've made a comment there.
Yeah, I was just thinking a bit more about what you were saying about the use of when you're in these kind of relational spaces,
Yes.
ensuring that the process goes well by using a different form of cognition. When you have people who are going to be instinctively thinking through certain deterministic or non-complex patterns, and then deliberately bringing in this ontological perspective that's, you know, contextual and historical, that's a really nice complement to something I was listening to recently, which talks a lot about like biospheres and how the value of context and history kind of connects and ties into that as well.
Yes, I think it does. I think, you know, this isn't the only way to get to these ideas. You know, there are the book, in a sense, I talk about resonance with other ideas. You know, I read certain political writers and biological writers, and, you know, people have written books on context, for example, or flow. You know, there's many ideas that fit with this, but I think it's kind of There's an interesting question, Lorelei, about how to develop this intuition. Yes, I think the first thing that helps is to tell people that it's viable, that you know, one of the things that's happening in organizations is they've almost, because of the whole amount of data that's available, you know, if I go into an organization these days, people will say, how are you going to measure it? What will be the outcomes? You know, how do you predict that? They're going to ask me quite mechanical and fact-based questions. And they're not daft questions, you know, they don't want to waste their money and, you know, just have me setting off doing something and we don't know where it's heading. But they are limiting cognitively. They start to make people feel that if you don't have an answer to how will you do it, how will you measure it, how will I know, you know, what are the outcomes, that it's kind of defective. And it kind of holds people in a more mechanical level of confidence, where they're not really allowed to play with intuition or experiment or, you know, or disagree even. You know, there's something about there's a loss of curiosity, creativity, novelty, flow, joyfulness, playfulness that's getting knocked out of people's experience. And so one of the things that you can do with organizations, for example, is to say to people, you know, come and observe this meeting. You know, what do you think went on? What was causing, you know, there's a kind of espoused view of how that decision was made. You know, we analysed this information and we thought this was a good strategy, so we did it. But, you know, if you ask people in a safe space, well, what do you think what went on? You get people say things like, well, you know, the engineering director never liked the manufacturing director. You know, they've had the long history of not liking each other, and if one says something, the other's never going to agree. You know, that kind of thing. Or, you know, that person comes with a very fixed view about the kind of strategy that will work, and it doesn't really matter what you say, they're not going to deviate from that view. So you get people to get some confidence in their both, you know, using information that's broader than the espoused facts, and using their intuition. So you might say, well, what do you think should have happened? Or what do you think was going on? And another way to get people to kind of develop their intuition is to ask after meetings, you know, what's happened today that was new, exciting, interesting, or surprising? And often in organizations, people never get asked that. They're never asked about, you know, the sales guys, for example, the people out in the field often pick up information about what's going on in the broader field, and it never gets brought back into the organization. So just getting people with the idea that they're allowed to have opinions or pick up antennae or find something interesting or surprising. Maybe something went well that they never imagined would go, you know, it was not in their antennae. You know, sometimes people say this strategy is not working, and you say, well, what is working? And you suddenly find there's a whole load of things that are going really well, and, you know, that they haven't noticed because it's not been part of this vision. So I think it is a bit like you do with children. You know, if you're wanting children to develop their intuition, what would you do? You know, even doing things like working with, I sometimes work with postcards in organizations and say, make a collage of the organization culture. And that allows people to address culture in a more subjective way, and also in a way express something about the culture that they wouldn't put into words. So they're the kind of things I think you can do to actually develop this sort of intuition. Okay, any other thoughts right now, or I shall go on to my final bit. A few people having to go. Right, everybody okay? Finn, you okay? Yep. So the last bit then is interesting to me, and the fact that this organisation is called Integrative Altruism, is it kind of made me think, well, how does that fit with all this stuff that I'm talking about and think about? And I guess I've got a number of comments about it. So one of them is that I can have an intention to be altruistic, but what it means in practice is going to be quite context specific. So to give you a kind of a daft little example, I'm the kind of friend who, when my friends turn up, I go, how are you really? You know, you were saying last time that was a bit difficult, you know, and how's it going now? And how are you feeling? And, you know, if I'm not careful, I turn every interaction into a kind of therapy session. You know, I'm empathetic, and I have this idea that to be altruistic is to ask those, to give it the opportunity to ask those deeper questions. And it occurred to me with one friend that she'd started to avoid me because she didn't want to do that every time, you know, she saw me. She just wanted to go, oh, hey, hi, how are you? Have you seen any good films recently? And, you know, how's work going? Oh, fine, you know, and have a laugh. And the point about that story is that I have to refine my behavior. And every time I have to reflect on, in this situation, what does it mean to be empathetic? What does it mean to try and be nice to my friend? And it may not be that my idea of it's always good to ask people deeper questions and get them talking, you know, that's me, isn't it? That's what I think, but it's not what people want. I have to kind of refine my actions in order to be altruistic, even though my intentions may be altruistic. So I thought that kind of is interesting, that being altruistic is a practice that I have to consider what it means in every situation, in every context. And it's kind of the same, you know, in on the bigger scale as well. It's you know, in a way, it's a complex issue. And I was talking earlier today about two of my favourite authors, one of whom I've read all my life, and the other I'm relatively new to. And the one I've read all my life is a science fiction and fantasy writer called Ursula Le Guin, who I think is just an amazing thinker. And I come back to her work over decades. I've been reading her work since my mid-20s. I come back to it and I see a new level of thinking in it. I find something new. And it's because I've changed. So I have a dialogue with these books, and it takes me a little bit deeper and further and more into a nuance of understanding things. The same with reading the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching is a complex set of parables of overlapping ideas, some of which are contradictory, although they kind of sit within a general frame of thinking. And when I come back to the Tao Te Ching, I will read something and I will see something fresh in it. It's a dialogue. It's a dialogic process. And I was reflecting on the difference between reading Ursula Le Guin and Octavia Butler, who I've come to relatively recently, who some of you will know. She was contemporary with Ursula Le Guin, but is a Black feminist science fiction and fantasy writer. And her books are darker and more complex. And when you read Ursula Le Guin, you know who are the goodies and who are the baddies. And it's all kind of, you know, to be altruistic, it's all kind of simple in to a degree. Whereas Octavia Butler confronts you all the time with, well, you know, who's good in this story and who's bad in this story? And was that altruistic or wasn't it altruistic? You know, if I'm trying to lead a good life, she holds you in the complexity and ambiguity, and forces you to reflect quite deeply on, well, do I think that was a good action, you know, or wasn't it? And I like that. I like the fact that some readers in dialogue and situations, you know, hold you in this kind of complexity. So I guess it makes me feel that you know, altruism is a more complex and deeper and more nuanced issue than we might think. It's not just about, you know, I'm going to do good. It can also get very colonial, can't it? About who decides what's good at a certainly at a more institutional level. The other point I wanted to make about altruism is something that I've got from reading from a whole variety of readers, but it is that it is integrative. So, for example, another writer called Judith Butler, who wrote a book 35 years ago on gender issues and feminism. She wrote a kind of seminal book on gender and feminism 35 years ago, and she's just written a new book, and she's become a kind of icon for a whole range of new people who are interested in kind of fluidity of identity. And I went to a talk by her, and I was expecting people of my age to be there. And in the main, it was quite young people, undergraduates, who see her as iconic, as supporting them in their explorations of identity. But what she held them to in the discussion was, you know, what is it that's behind your desire for freedom of identity? It is freedom of expression. It's freedom to be yourself. But you can't have, you know, if you want freedom for yourself, then, you know, it's important to want freedom for everyone. You can't just take your issue. You've got to think about race, age, disability, you know, gender fluidity. You've got to think about all of it. What are the conditions under which people can be themselves? And you've got to think about the paradox of that is if everybody's individualistically, very determinedly feels they have a right to be themselves, but what about what we're doing cooperatively? What about the climate? What about nature? You know, what about the non-human world? You know, we can't just say I've got a right for individuality, and it's a bit like the French phrase liberty, equality, and fraternity. You can't just take one of them, you know, liberty, without the paradox of, but it, you know, my freedom is your lack of freedom. You know, you know, how do we have both freedom and equality? That's a complex issue that needs reflecting about in the context and with the individuals. So I really like the fact you've used the phrase integrative altruism, because it really is placing in the center that to be altruistic isn't to pick off something, or it isn't simple. It is a practice of engaging with many issues that are all important, and, you know, trying to work in every individual moment to do the best you can, which takes me back to a final remark I want to make, really, which is a central Taoist idea, that is the idea of the path is made through walking. And this is actually a poem by Antonio Machado that was translated. Well, one of the translations was by a complexity biologist called Varela. And the phrase is, wanderer, there is no path. The path is made by walking. And it's an incredibly profound idea, which is to do with the fact that we are collectively co-creating the future. There isn't a right way to do things. There isn't a path we're trying to follow. You know, the Tao is translated as way making. It isn't like find the way and get on it. It is like we are way making with everything that is there. And it's not to say that we're not stepping onto a path that's already existing, but the future builds on that path, but is being made by what we do. So if I have values and intentions which are about wanting a future that is fair, resilient, sustainable, you know, including you know, people and planet and the future, if I'm trying to balance all those things up and bring myself into that, that's a complex issue, and it requires a practice of saying, in a sense, in this moment, and there's always only this moment, there's only now that I can that I have agency, is like, well, what am I going to choose to do? What am I going to choose to emphasize? You know, in this moment, what am I going to say to you? How am I going to respond to you? That's all there is. So there is something about that the future is made through our intentions, in a sense. They're shaping where I think I'm heading, but it's my actions in this moment that matter. And I think that's where there's also an element to kind of right action, which is a Buddhist phrase, which is, you know, if I want to get somewhere, which I think is more peaceful, but I'm getting there by lying, or by being or using my power over you in a particular way, even if I think I'm doing that for the general good, the thing that enters the system is the lie or the power over. And you never quite know whether you're going to get to the endpoint that you hoped for. So I think it for me brings me back to, you know, to behave altruistically is partly my intention about wanting the future to be fair, just, equitable, sustainable, you know, for planet, the non-human and the human world. That is what I think. But my actions, it's a complex issue of how best to do that in the moment. But what I've concluded is that if I'm ever lying to get there, or bullying, you know, or, you know, then, and I'm justifying that in my own mind, or appeasing, of course, is another one. You know, I don't like what they're doing, but it's, you know, I'll just appease it. I'm not going to stand my ground on this. You know, then what? That is what you're putting into the system. So I think that's quite a profound idea that comes from both complexity thinking, the path dependency that comes from there, and Taoism, that is quite challenging. So I want to stop there, and I think we should see if there are any questions or comments, and then I might find some things to say at the end. But I think that's perhaps where I wanted to get to. So any thoughts or questions? Finn, you've unmuted.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. One question that came to mind, and it might be ironically quite a mechanistic question, but I was curious. I was curious about if you can point to any ways that society is going wrong at the moment by not embracing this view, and how might our society or culture look differently if these ideas of complexity and Taoism kind of entered into the popular zeitgeist?
And of course they are in the popular zeitgeist, and they have been in the past much more. So you know, a lot of indigenous wisdom is very similar. It's about like how do we live in harmony with the natural world in which we're in, and with each other. So the philosophies that you get out of many sorts of indigenous wisdom, and Taoism is a form of indigenous wisdom, do support that. And you know, for some of us who are older, much older, some of these, a more community-based way of behaving was more common. There was a sort of post the end of the Second World War, and I'm afraid this is kind of a European and perhaps American view, really did have people pulling together. You know, that in the UK there was the health system, free health for all, free education for all. You know, it was a time in our history when there really was upward mobility, that through improved health and education, people from working class backgrounds really did, you know, get on and have a different world. And that was as a result of people who had saying, you know, look, we've got to pull together. We've got to make sure that you know, high rate taxation in the 1970s was 90%. You know, people are petrified to put it up by 0.5% these days, but it was 90%. And you know, there was more taxing that was seen as normal, and it paid for public services that allowed, you know, the opportunities that were more equal. The difference between managers and workers' salaries in the 1960s was a factor of 5 difference. It's these days it's over 150 difference. So you know, it is like it's gone out of our zeitgeist since 1989, and the sort of you know, a kind of neoliberal philosophy that's come in, and the role of the individual, and you know, there is no such thing as society was a phrase that was used. So it's kind of moved out, but it is within, you know, it is within our capability and knowledge. And I think, you know, and in a way complexity does explain this too, that path dependence, and somebody, Milia, I'm going to answer your questions as well. There's some good questions coming in now, and I'll go back to that. I'm just distracted by the second part of your question, Jamie, so which I'll come back to as well. So with path dependence, in both biological systems and human systems, if things get out of balance, if the powerful get more powerful, or in human systems the rich get richer, there's a lack of resilience in the system. And you know, if you look at the life cycle of forests, if they get to a very they can get to a point which is very kind of rigid, there's no way in or out, there's the winners and the losers, there's a very kind of rigid hierarchy, and it tends to be very unable to withstand shocks, and is prone to collapse. So what we seem to be seeing in our society at the moment is huge inequality, increasing, accelerating inequality, a sense that growth is a way out of it. But if you've got huge inequality, a lot of that growth goes to the wealthy, as opposed to everyone. Growth is an interesting concept on a finite planet. You know, there's a lot to unpack in this. I'm saying this all very quickly, but it explains that path dependency, that, you know, power leads to more power. You know, inequality, if people are selfish, you know, selfish power allows you to use your power over people and get more, and you know, construct the narrative, and, you know, control the press, and control, you know, people's ability to challenge the dominant narrative. So I think it explains where we're heading, and also explains how to, you know, sharing power, having less inequality. Now, you know, if you're asking me the question of how do we get from A to B, then either people start to give up power, you know, or they put taxes up, or governments decide to operate in a particular way. And remember, we have climate change going on at the moment, and that the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is still going up. It hasn't stopped going up with everything that's going on. You know, we have to put the collapse word into this, and, you know, we are at risk more than in my lifetime of having forms of societal collapse, because, you know, as some of the political writers write about at the end of the communist era, you know, if people are sufficiently unable to live where they're living, you know, and can't eat, and you know, have no food, and can't live there, people rise. You know, in the end, people rise, and that's what many of the commentators on the end of you know, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, a lovely book if you haven't read it, called The Power of the Powerless by Václav Havel. It talks about that in the end people have more power than they think, and people rise, so to speak. So I think it explains path dependency. What I'm saying when I use this phrase path dependency is that the future is co-created by the things that happen. It's not determined. It's not determined by them. So in other words, I could say to you, you know, my life has been shaped by the things that happened to me on the way. That's true. And it's not a perfect story, but I can tell you some of the things that have happened, and some of the choices I made, and some of the things that happened that I had no choice over. And yet, in a path-dependent system, the future may not have every option open, but it has more than one option open. So what the phrase is, that the future is shaped but not determined by the past. So determined is a very precise thing. So that's you know, where I'm trying to go in terms of talking about path dependency. Back to this sensitive dependence on initial conditions, which is something Jamie's raised. In the mathematical versions and the early mathematical versions of the maths of chaos theory, which is a particular early set of difference equations that had some very interesting effects, they are deterministic, and they do show sensitivity to initial conditions. what a complexity view that I'm describing is showing is that sometimes things are really triggered by particular events. You can think of things in your life where you say, golly, you know, if I hadn't made that decision, I didn't know at the time, but that was a pivotal decision I made, or a pivotal thing that happened to me. And, you know, it changed the path of my life enormously. So that's sometimes true. There are also situations, and the phrase that's used is equifinality, where it sometimes feels like whatever you do, you know, the system is so robust, it doesn't matter what you do, you end up in the same place. So it's much more complex than sensitivity to initial conditions. That's a particular mathematical, it's an attribute of a particular mathematical expression of chaos theory. But in the ontology of complexity, the stuff I'm talking about, that comes from understanding biological systems, you've got this paradox that the very variation sometimes helps to hold things in place, because there's slightly different pathways that can be taken and different resources that can be used that make it adaptive. So the diversity matters, but it isn't always the case that a particular event is pivotal. Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. And it's where the practice of, you know, you sometimes feel, and again, I felt that in board meetings or in all sorts of meetings, you know, sometimes you think, golly, if I can get this right, if there's something happening here that's really important, if I can seize this moment well, it will make a huge difference. And if I don't, it won't. And it's a bit like Julius Caesar says in one of Shakespeare's plays, you know, sometimes you have to seize the moment, or you spend your life wallowing in the shallows. And so it's a more subtlety than this idea of sensitivity to initial conditions. So Jamie, I hope that's my answer to your question. Karen Barad, Karen Barad takes a particular view of quantum physics that focuses on the deterministic quantum field aspect of it, but in my view, doesn't look at the collapse, what's called in some languages the collapse of the wave function, the idea of Schrodinger's cat, and you know, things in a wave equation, in a field theory equation, you can incorporate things that are incommensurable, things that can't be true at the same time. So I like the way she's introduced the idea of patterning and relationality and interaction, but I don't quite fit with some of what she says. I think it's a particular interpretation that doesn't quite fit with how I see things, but you know, she has certainly opened up a field and changed people's views of kind of this idea of things interacting in a very helpful way. So that's not a very good answer, John, but it's just not quite where I fit. I find some of it, I don't quite read the field in the way that she does. So that's not a very good answer really, but I hope that's of some help. Any other thoughts?
Can you please say a little more about variations keeping the system stable? Thank you.
So if you just think about well, let me use the example of a family. I'm sorry, it's a kind of simple example. If you had a very rigid, you know, some families are very rigid, you know, certainly when I was growing up, you know, I used to go to some people's houses and there was a kind of rigidity about, you know, who spoke and what you did at the table and how you ate and, you know, who talked and who decided. It was a kind of hierarchy in a way. So it didn't have much variation. So if something went wrong, you know, like there was a fire, let's say, you know, there was a fire and you had to, the house was burnt down. If the man, you know, if the guy or the man or the woman or the, you know, the hierarchy wasn't there, and you had to adapt to a very sudden change of circumstances, a very rigid family would find that difficult because there was no variation in the behavior. If you have a family that's not chaotic, that does have some norms and ways of doing things, but, you know, let's say grandma comes to stay, the kids will shuffle around the room and nothing much goes wrong, it's kind of okay. Or if mum and dad are late home from work, then, you know, the elder brother can make the tea and the little ones will allow that. It doesn't fall apart. There's an adaptation that comes from allowing of some variation. So that's really what I'm saying. If you approach a strategy, or if you approach the management of an organization in a way that seems very efficient, where you say everybody knows their role and they can fulfill their role, and we don't really care what you think, you know, or we don't want you to adapt, that if the market changes or the circumstances change or there's a sudden illness, it falls apart. Whereas if you've got some variation in pathways and variation in who can do what and variation in relationships, you can have things that are both stable and adaptive at the same time. So that's what I'm trying to say. Does that help? Oh, good. Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah, I can hop in here with another question sort of about altruism and the relations here. So if I recall correctly, in your book, you counsel challenging early before lock-in.
Yeah.
But the earlier you intervene, the less formed the system is and the harder to predict or know what your intervention will produce. So for me, I'm thinking about sort of the effect of altruist early work on AI risk, for example, may have helped spur the creation of DeepMind and OpenAI, organizations that are now racing to superintelligence and exacerbating the very risks that the work hoped to mitigate. So early intervention gives you more leverage, but less ability to know what that leverage will do. So, like, how do you think about that tension? If that makes sense.
It does. So what I'm talking about with challenging early, in the particular context of what I was talking about in the book, is if you think things are, you know, if you see somebody bullying somebody, then, you know, or if you think a whole regime is really going in a bad direction, there's sometimes the feeling, so this is a political statement, there's a feeling that sometimes you have to appease, you have to go along with. So you know, I can think of more recent examples, but you know, if you take what happened around Adolf Hitler, people couldn't kind of quite imagine that you know, the things that happened were going to happen. So they kind of thought he was just, you know, kind of shooting his mouth off, and that they should kind of appease him because he wasn't really going to do all these things. And what I mean by challenging early is, you know, when people really get into power, they really have power. So you can be killed, you know, and you can lose your job. But if you are willing to challenge early when it's safer to challenge, in a sense, you're kind of challenging, you're not letting the norm of that behavior lock in to the point when it becomes impossible or dangerous to challenge it. So that's what I mean. You don't know where, that's my whole point really, is you don't know where it's going, but you know something's not right. So in terms of developing technology, I think it's much more difficult. If you have a sense that something's unethical, or you know, it's or something needs the legislative or the security issues need to be addressed earlier, you need to say so, because sometimes when the power gets into that, it becomes much more difficult to then add those kind of checks and balances on later. So I can't, in a way, I can't answer your question. I think it's outside my field, but I think if there's something that doesn't feel right, you know, it's even though I think the point about altruism for me at my level is I don't know whether it'll make things better really, I mean, maybe it would be better if I didn't appease the bullies, maybe they're going to do a better job on some level. But I trust for myself, and I think that the Taoist view is that things that are bullying or unequal or unfair or lies are just not good things to have in the system, and I should challenge them early and not just feel like, oh well, it's a bit too dangerous and maybe it's okay and I don't know. And it's often an excuse for doing nothing. The other excuse is, well, it doesn't really matter if I've got if I fly around the world 3 times a week, because I'm only one person, so it doesn't really matter. Or it doesn't matter if I have this big fast car because there's only me, so it doesn't matter. But the point is, if it matters, it matters. And if you say, well, I'm not going to have a fast car, then you might influence somebody else, or you don't know how those collective actions are going to lead up. So for some people that's a naive view, and I accept that, but it is a Taoist view, and it's my view of how the path is made through walking. But come back, I mean, what do you think, Jack? I mean, I don't think I can answer your question. It's sort of outside my field, really.
I mean, I'm not sure if I have an answer either. I just know that, and especially I think complexity thinking supports the idea of there being lots of potential unintended consequences to your actions, right? If you don't understand all these complex mechanics and interactions, you may set out trying to do one thing and end up causing something differently. So that's something that we have to think about as we try to be altruistic in the world. Is like, that's why I raised the example of sort of early EA work on AI, sort of spurring the creation of these companies that are now exacerbating the risks that we're worried about, or something, which is like, yeah, you may set out to try and make the world safer and then end up making it more dangerous without intending to, or something like that. So that was just what the sort of the reason for the question there.
Yes. But I think I still feel that there is an understanding of complexity, which is about, well, it is complex and you don't know what the outcomes are, but you never know what the outcomes are, because what the outcomes would have been here, even if you could have known everything, because things are constantly changing, and the whole context is constantly changing. You can never know. It is path dependent, but it's shaped but not determined by the past. But what would I do? It's a really interesting question, because when you talk about these big things, like we're going, this, it's like antibiotics, isn't it? Antibiotics on one level has done great things for the world. Now all our cows are full of them, and our rivers are full of them. It's had an unintended consequence, and maybe all you can do is maybe what we should have done more of is at the early side of AI is think more about what could be the unintended consequences and how do we mitigate against them now. So that foresighting, perhaps is something that needs to be more inbuilt at the beginning. So you don't know, but you can imagine some of those unintended consequences, can't you, in terms of a kind of scenario planning. So, but it's it's a fair question. Well, I feel like we're coming to the end of this, don't you? Any passing final comments, or I don't know what people.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for your thoughts and everything you've come up with today. I thought it was really helpful.
Yes, well, it's you're all in a slightly different world to me. So, like, what's the value of optionality? I don't know what optionality means to you, so I don't know. It's what is optionality?
Yeah, as I understand what you're trying to get at, the system is generally unpredictable, and you don't know what your ultimate outcomes will be. And so whatever plan you might come up with might be like systematically devaluing optionality.
What's optionality?
Sorry, basically the value of like being able to choose something different. And so like preserving that as an option has some value.
Yes, I mean, pragmatically, the world isn't endlessly complex and we know nothing. I know what I'm going to do tomorrow, more or less. I know the consequences of my actions, more or less, and things are relatively stable. It's holding in mind that they're not kind of scientifically defined. That there is a level of unpredictability that's just in the world. You know, the world is unpredictable to a degree, and when we start to behave, you know, like a lot of economic models assume a level of predictability that it's hard to sanction. So what do you do? Well, I think you do your best to say, this is a relatively stable situation. I think this is a pretty good choice. You know, I'm going to go along with that, but I'm going to watch it carefully in case, you know, there's consequences, you know, or unexpected successes, or the world changes. So it's a both and, I think, about, you know, doing something and seeing what happens sometimes, you know, because doing something can reveal something about the patterning in the world that we may not have seen. It's doing things, but being aware that things may emerge or change radically and rapidly sometimes. And finding this is what's so difficult for the world, is finding this idea of, well, I am going to make this, I'm going to choose this option now, but can I do it in such a way that other options are not entirely closed to me? Now, by doing something, you will close some options, but it's holding the idea that which is perhaps is what you're saying to me, is holding some options or trying out more than one thing, rather than imagining that there's an optimal answer, is part of the message of this. Yeah, I think that's right.
Thank you.
Okay, well, Jack or Finn, any final remarks from you, or are we coming to an end?
Yeah, just to say thank you so much for this. It's been absolutely fascinating. Yeah, one thing I really took away from this is in the kind of uncertainty of the world, it seems to be a lot more important the way we do things rather than going for some specific goal, which I think is probably an issue that a lot of EA organizations have run into in the past, going back to what Jack was referring to earlier, of OpenAI and DeepMind. But yeah, thank you so much for this. It's been such an interesting talk.
Well, I hope so. And that's a field I know very little about. So that whole world that some of you live in is beyond my ken. So thank you for inviting me, and I've enjoyed myself and enjoyed your questions as well. So have a nice evening.
Thank you so much for joining us, Jean. I just would ask everybody to give Jean a virtual round of applause. And yeah, just to express our gratitude for the very interesting and lovely talk. I had a great time. Just one last thing, if anybody has feedback or suggestions for the speaker series moving forward, feel free to contact me or Finn. And yeah, I'm happy to leave it there. Thanks so much for coming out, everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great weekend. Oh, Layla has a hand up. Was there a last thought there?
Oh, no, sorry. That was me trying to send a thank you.
Yeah. No worries. If anybody wants to contact me, contact me through Finn. I'm always happy to have conversations and interactions or feedback myself. So feel free to be in touch if you'd like to. Okay, take care, everybody. I'm going to go then. Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks,
have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.